So what is the station rotation model? The station rotation model is one of the 7 models of blended learning. The whole idea of stations is nothing new, and it's very common, especially in the elementary setting. You'll often hear terms like stations or centers, workshop, or even learning studios used most often. Now, as you move up into middle and high school, stations are not traditionally used by teachers on a regular basis. Oftentimes, you might see stations used after the content is taught. In the station rotation model, students are learning the content as they move through each station. Here's an example. Know that the number of stations and the time in each can vary depending on your lesson goals and the needs of your students. So, for example, you could have a teacher-led station, which could include a mini lesson or even conferencing with students. You'll have a digital content or online learning where activities that provide instant feedback are part of this station. And the purpose of this is for feedback to be provided to students and data for teachers to better inform their instruction. You'll have an independent workstation. So this is where you can consider using playlists or choice boards, hyperdocs, or even independent reading. And then you may have like a future ready station where students have the ability to apply the content using the 5 C's, where they're using creativity, collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and citizenship. You may often include content specific activities using like the 5 E's in science or Kessler stations. Now, one of the main differences between traditional learning stations and the station rotation model of blended learning is that at least one station must be an online learning station. Now, when we are adding technology to a station, we want to make sure that the tech enhances and improves the activity, giving students the opportunity to learn at their own pace, giving teachers the ability to differentiate instruction and personalize practice. It needs to add value. Now, if you're a teacher who relies on whole group instruction or lecture-based instruction, this shift from whole group to small group learning activities may be a little challenging to plan and implement. And the approach to lesson design changes, and the role of the teacher during a lesson also changes. So you'll become more of a guide on the side as opposed to a sage on the stage. Students move from being passive consumers of information to active and engaged learners.
So let's think about planning of stations. One of the easiest things to do if you're just getting started is to begin with normal whole group lessons. Here's a basic linear lesson. Essentially, you're going to take a linear lesson and think about how much you're going to break it up into smaller, more manageable chunks so that the student is at the center of learning. Think about this example lesson plan. Who's doing all the work? You're leading the QOD. You're leading the homework review. You're leading the direct instruction. You're assigning homework. At the end of the lesson, we want our students to have more sweat on the brow, not us. So in this example, I'm going to start off with a great intro to the day's lesson, a great lead of where I'm setting the stage for a lesson. I'm not going to start with homework because I know the most important part of the class is the first and last 5 minutes. Then I'm going to take my lesson and I'm going to create 4 different ways that students can interact and engage with the content I was going to teach during direct instruction. Think about the different learning modalities here. By only lecturing, I'm only reaching my auditory learners, no one else. You'll want to create stations that don't depend on each other or build on top of each other, as in you can't complete one without another one. And then at the end of the lesson is where you can do a whole group wrap up and reflection. The key thing here is to make sure your learning stations tie directly back to your learning intentions and success criteria.
Now, stations are traditionally done in a face-to-face environment, but we've seen a lot of great examples over the past year of stations being used online through the use of breakout rooms. So let's hear it from Jennifer Post. She's a Math 6 teacher who has used stations in both environments.
In my opinion, centers are a really wonderful way to structure a classroom. It allows me that one-on-one and small group time, but it also allows students some independent work time so they can practice their skills, and they can also work with partners. Some things that are exactly the same, no matter if you're face-to-face or you're virtual, is the structure and planning of your centers. Always determine what do you want your centers to look like. In my case, I always have four. I have a teacher center. I have an activity center where it's think seat work. What are you doing at your seat? I have a technology center, some kind of component for practice. And then I have a hands-on center where the kids are practicing through either games or building and virtual manipulatives. So I always have those four centers. And in the beginning of the year, you train your students explicitly in what is it going to look like? What is the teacher's role? What is the student's role? How are you going to practice that? Where are you going to turn in your papers if you have papers, or how are you going to submit your work virtually? All of those things are the same. Also, I always plan activities for immediate feedback, so that way students can continue their learning without interrupting the learning of others. So I allow them those ways of hearing, are they on the right track? But in a face-to-face classroom and a virtual classroom, there were some differences. Face-to-face, there's actual physical movement. Students are up and out of their seats, moving to different places and locations in the room, doing things. There were hands-on manipulatives. Things that were easier were, if I needed them to work with something that students may not have at home, it was much easier to just, put them on a table and students can react with them. However, virtual centers, you think about how can you make that using a virtual manipulative, of which the internet has 5 zillion things for you. In a face-to-face classroom, when I was working in my teacher center with my students, I was working in the back table. I could see students work immediately and correct it and give feedback immediately. I had to come up with a norm in virtual centers when they were in teacher center that they had to have their cameras on and they had to be able to talk to me, but they would angle their cameras down so that way that we can look at their notebook. And it was really helpful for me to be able to still see that student work so I could correct it and also see just, are we on the right track? So I had some feedback for myself as well. In a face-to-face classroom, you do have to train for noise levels in the room. What is it going to sound like? How are we not interrupting other centers going on or even other classrooms in the building? What was beautiful, one of the great things in virtual centers is breakout rooms, because in breakout rooms, students could really talk at whatever level they were on, and their excitement did not interrupt any of the other stations going on because they were contained. I also did have breakout rooms that went underneath, so that way if they were working with partners within their team, they had another place that they could go and still talk. Another skill I had to teach that was pretty challenging for sixth graders in the beginning of the year was learning how to share their document or their slide and their games through Google, teaching them how to do that so they can work on the same document. However, those were really the only differences. I found that face-to-face and virtual centers can be exactly the same. You just have to do some modifications and some tweaks. I hope you find that helpful. Good luck with your centers.
Station rotation lessons do not need to be completed in one class period, but rather can span multiple class periods. Spanning multiple days gives teachers the opportunity to do some announcements, type introduction prior to letting the students pick up where they left off. In addition, having multi-day rotations gives students the opportunity to dive deeper into content that they would in a typical one-class rotation.
Now, as we wrap up this station, here's some food for thought. Teacher talk versus student talk. Who's doing all the talking in your classroom? Think about that for a moment. And then this quote: whoever is doing the reading, writing, talking, and thinking is doing the learning. Deep Thoughts by Samantha Bennett. Okay. Do we feel good about that?
I think so.
Okay.
I stumbled a